Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis. Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 13 of my Mean Streets of Gadgetzan card review. I'm down to the final few reviews, and I've got to move through them pretty quickly because the expansion is about to hit. So let's go ahead and jump right into these cards, and I won't be dedicating quite as much time for discussion to each card, but I'll still be addressing what I think the overall quality of the card is. So bear with me as I jump through all these, starting off with Wrathion, a new neutral legendary. This is a 6-mana 4/5. It has Taunt, but also a really cool battle cry. Draw cards until you draw a card that isn't a dragon. So that's an interesting new kind of synergy we've never seen before, and is going to make Wrathion a very good fit for dragon decks, because clearly he is at least a 6-mana 4/5 Taunt with a draw 1 card effect, because even if that first one's not a dragon, he's still going to draw you a single card. And I think arguably that would be a pretty playable card, just because, you know, it's a chill Wind Yeti with Taunt, which is slightly better than something like Sinjin Shieldmaster. So, you know, even at 4 mana, this card would be better. It's like a 4.5 mana card, and that card draw really puts it pretty close at 6 mana to its, you know, expected value. But there's so much potential upside, because potentially you could draw 3 or 4 dragons in a single turn. I mean, theoretically, you could draw infinite, well, not infinite, but, you know, 29 dragons or 25 dragons or something if you're able to play this guy fast enough, and if there were enough dragons in your deck, right? You know, 2 to 3 is not a crazy thought. Even just 1 to 2 cards makes Wrathion really good. And the nice thing about that Taunt is that you don't feel too bad sending this out there on turn 6, because at least it's something your opponent is going to have to think about and address as a Taunt minion, so it's not like they can just ignore it and run face, so that you never have time to actually use the cards you draw. So he's got some nice defensive utility built in, tons of dragon synergy, decent stats, really cool, interesting high synergy effect for dragon decks, and it seems like dragon decks, particularly Dragon Priest, are going to be good. So I think Wrathion is a very strong card, and we'll definitely see some play. I like this one a lot. So let's move on to the next neutral legendary up for review in this one. It's Ginzo the Shark. This is a 4-mana 5/4, and whenever this attacks, both players draw until they have 3 cards. So off the bat, the stats here are fine. That's a really nice stat alignment for a 4-drop. It's an aggressive one. It's worked with stuff like Tomb Pillager in the past, so we know that this, from a stat standpoint, can be played. It's just whether or not that effect is good enough to warrant including this in your deck. And I actually don't know that it is. Cards with similar kinds of effect in the past are Jeeves. We saw Jeeves with Goblins versus Gnomes. But he would draw you 3 cards at the end of each turn. So Jeeves was a guaranteed card draw. Like if you were in a super aggro deck with a very, very low curve, you could play Jeeves and rely on the fact that you knew he was going to refill your hand with at least a couple cards, potentially 3 cards. And if your opponent didn't address Jeeves, then it was going to keep happening, right? With Ginza the Shark, he has a much, much better stat allocation than Jeeves, but it's not guaranteed, so it's much riskier to include this in many ways if you're one of those all-in decks. It's no guaranteed out like with Jeeves. There's no mech synergy like with Jeeves. Often Jeeves could kind of feel like a waste for your opponent to kill too, just because it was a minion that didn't have a lot of stats. So this sometimes will just feel good to kill anyway. So there's a little bit of mind games there. So ultimately, I think Ginza the Shark, although a similarly styled card, probably isn't as good. Well, I shouldn't say that. Jeeves wasn't very good either, in my opinion. But I think Genzo is equally not that good, if that makes sense. So not worse than Jeeves necessarily, just different, but also not that strong. This card theoretically could see play in some sort of really hyper aggro deck that's like at the top of the curve as a 4-mana aggressively minded minion, but I think that's rather unlikely, and ultimately Ginza the Shark is going to be below average in quality. So let's move on to another legendary this time around. It's the new Warrior class legendary, and surprisingly, it's a really low cost card as a Warrior legendary, which is not something we've seen. This is Hobart Grapplehammer, a new 2-mana 2/2 with a really interesting battle cry: give all weapons in your hand and deck +1 attack. So he's like the ultimate weapon buff card. That's a really strong effect because, you know, a lot of warrior decks would run at least 3 weapons, something like 2 Fiery War Axes and a Gore Howl if you're in a control environment. This might be even more relatable to something like a Pirate Warrior deck, which runs potentially even more weapons, right? You've got stuff like N'Zoth's First Mate to give you the tiny weapon. But I guess that wouldn't actually receive a buff from this, would it? It has to be an actual playable weapon. So that's one limitation here for Pirate Warrior, but still buffing that Fiery War Axe, buffing like an Arcanite Reaper that you sometimes see in those kinds of decks that are really aggressive, would be very strong. A 4-2 Fiery War Axe is better than a 3-2 Fiery War Axe. That said, I think really durability is one thing that's overlooked here, and a pretty big disadvantage for this card, the fact that it doesn't give you the durability, and the fact that it actually lands on the Fiery War Axe curve. In other words, it's a 2-mana card, means you kind of have to delay that Fiery War Axe sometimes. Without the coin anyway, you get to coin this guy out on 1, play Fiery War Axe on 2, but the rest of the time, the other half of your games, this means you'll have to play Fiery War Axe on 3, which is slightly off curve and a little awkward as far as mana is concerned. So I've seen a lot of positive reactions to this guy. I do think it's a decent above average card with a very strong effect that has a lot of potential. There's also cards like Fool's Bane that gets even better with this. I guess technically Tentacles for Arms gets kind of insane with this, right? Because there's just more value on all those charges. So there are ways for this to work in certain environments, I think. But for the average warrior deck, I'm not really sure you're going to make room for this card. So maybe in pirate variants that are very reliant on weapon damage, and maybe that's it. It has to be a deck that's fine with the low curve card like this. So it's an above average card as far as stats and effect are concerned, but it's one that I don't think fits in the context of warrior all that perfectly. So even though it's a decent card, I'm not sure right now that it's going to be played a ton. So we'll have to wait and see. So let's move on to some more warrior cards. This time around, it's the 2-mana Public Defender. It's a 0/7 taunt minion. I don't like this one much at all. It definitely has some potential in taunt warrior decks, which are not something we've ever seen take off or be particularly successful, because this card's really only good when it gets buffed. And that seems like it's a pretty hard condition to pull off. Plus, you're probably just sending this out there to get beat on for a turn or two before you can really utilize those buffs. It does look better in Grimy Goons decks where it gets hand buffs so that, you know, it can become like a 2/9 or a 3/10 for 2 mana. But that's a pretty slow style of play, so if your opponent has any way to efficiently clear a taunt like that, and a lot of decks do have efficient ways to trade up or deal with your board and then just run over you, I still don't think this card's going to work. So I see a pretty limited utility here. I mean, in the end, a minion that can't defend itself, that can't attack, is just a free trade for your opponents. And unlike a card like Doomsayer, which you might ultimately end up comparing this to, since they're both 2-mana 0/7s that kind of stall out your opponent, Doomsayer has the benefit, of course, of potentially killing your opponent's entire board and stalling their entire turn out. Like, they don't want to develop any more minions. This card doesn't do that, even though they're both kind of 0/7 taunts. Public Defender never has that huge upside that a Doomsayer might have. So a much weaker card in general, and I think this is only going to ever be played in really specific kinds of decks, and I don't really think it's even going to work very well then. So below average card. Let's move on to some hunter cards. Up first is the Smuggs Crate, a 1-mana spell that gives a random beast in your hand +2/+2. So this is some more Grimy Goons hand buff style synergy. Clearly there's a lot of value in this card, like a +2/+2 for 1 mana is good. Like, that's really cheap. And there are a lot of times, I think, playing Hunter where I feel like I have a spare mana laying around, the Animal Companion on 4. There's just always that awkward turn where you float some mana. So this is the kind of card that could fill in those gaps and still give you some payback. I think the problem, of course, is that it's just a tad slow. because ultimately you have to cast the spell. You have to get the minion that's buffed played, so you have to spend that mana on that minion, and that minion has to wait a turn to attack. So there's a lot of downtime in that entire cycle. So even though it's a fast card from a mana standpoint, it's pretty slow to actually come to fruition. So I'm kind of torn on this one. I think it's technically solid, an efficient card, but probably isn't that good in practice or in actual games. So outside of some sort of spell synergy hunter, which is a possibility with things like lock and load, I don't think Smuggs Crate is going to be played a ton. Let's move on to another hunter spell, pretty similar, but this time it's a secret called the Hidden Cache. 2 mana, of course, because it's a secret, and after your opponent plays a minion, give a random minion in your hand +2/+2. So a lot of similarities there between these two, but I think Hidden Cache is actually even worse. It's going to go off very easily. It's one of the most easily triggered secrets we've probably ever seen, actually, as far as Hunter is concerned, just because they play a minion that's going to happen almost every turn, or a vast majority of turns, against most decks. So you're going to get that buff off. The question is a +2/+2 worth 2 mana? It is, but it's not like super valuable. You see the same thing here, a +2/+2 for 1 mana. That's obviously twice as efficient. So this card's not all that strong from an efficiency or value standpoint. It's still got the same speed issues that the previous card has. There's nothing about this that instantly impacts your opponent's board or provides a huge tempo advantage that a card like Freezing Trap can provide. So Hidden Cache to me feels pretty weak on its surface and really weak in actual games. I don't think this card's going to see much play at all. Even in Grimy Goons style decks, I think there are better options and better secrets that are going to make a bigger influence on the actual game. So let's move on to some mage cards, starting off with Freezing Potion, 0 mana spell that allows you to freeze an enemy. So that's both the enemy heroes and enemy minions. And I mean, freezing is great because it's a nice little stall that basically negates a minion or a weapon for a turn. That's cool. It also has some surprising synergy with Shatter, a card that never made a ton of sense, but now looks a little better with a card like Freezing Potion that gives you a really cheap targeted freeze, so you kind of have a 2-card destroy a minion combo. But really, 2-card destroy a single minion combos aren't that good. It's very cheap and efficient, granted, but you have to run both Freezing Potion and Shatter in your deck. And the cards themselves have value, and they take up card slots, and they take up draws. So there's going to be a lot of instances where drawing a Freezing Potion is just too dead of a draw that makes so little of an impact on the game. Yeah, it could set up Ice Lances, but Frostbolt does the same thing, and it has a lot of extra utility as well. So I don't think this card's ever going to be played in actual constructed decks. I just think it's too low value for taking up a slot in your deck. But there are going to be those times where it comes off Babbling Book and it matters. There's also going to be those times where it comes off Babbling Book and it's a huge failure. So I think Blizzard probably put this card in almost as a balance of sorts, just to make sure there are some weaker spells in the set so that not every Kabbalist Tome gives you amazing 3 fireball kinds of outcomes. So occasionally you get the Freezing Potion that doesn't do a ton, but it still has some sort of niche utility that makes it fun and interesting and could have a positive impact on the game as well. So a neat little card, not good in constructed format at all as an actual card in your list, but a card I'm glad is in the game at the very least. Moving on to another mage spell, this time it's the Greater Arcane Missiles. So we all know Arcane Missiles. This one somehow costs 6 mana more. It still shoots 3 missiles at random enemies, so the same kind of effect. But these missiles instead deal 3 damage each. So just a super version of Arcane Missile. So that's a total of 9 damage on this base card. 9 damage for 7 mana is not bad. I mean, you compare other cards like Fireball is 6 damage for 4 mana. Pyroblast is 10 damage for 10 mana. So this looks okay from a pure efficiency standpoint. The problem, of course, is that the outcome is random. So with Arcane Missiles, you tend to not mind the randomness so much because it's such a low-cost card that there's not a lot of penalty if it whiffs. It's just something you throw out there, you hope it hits. You hope it activates your Flame Waker. Like, there's not a lot of downside in playing that randomness. This one, you're committing 7 mana to the randomness. So it's, if it fails, if all 3 hit face and you're trying to kill minions, you know, if you got 3 health minions out there you want to kill and they all 3 hit the face, that's a huge whiff. So there's a lot of extra risk in running this card. That said, I think this is pretty interesting. I think I haven't seen a lot of discussion on this yet, but I could almost see this as a damage spell in Freeze Mage, because the way this would work with spell damage, right, is that it's not the amount of missiles that would go up. I think it's the amount of damage each missile does that goes up. So with the +2 spell damage that Freeze Mages typically run right now, that means that each missile is going to do 5 damage, and you're going to shoot 3 missiles, which means this is a 7 mana, 15 damage card if there are no other targets on the board. And Freeze Mage can often keep an opponent's board relatively clean. So there might be those instances where this is like a super Pyroblast to the face. Now, it's not going to pump out more total damage than all the Fireball, Frostbolt, Ice Lance stuff that Freeze Mage does currently, but it might serve as a pseudo replacement for something like Flame Strike or Blizzard that can be both a face damage spell and have extra utility as a potential board clear spell as well. If it just hits like 1 or 2 minions, kills that Emperor Thaurissan with spell damage, or just kills off some Tunnel Trogs and some wolves that Shaman likes to play. So I don't know. I kind of am thinking this card could be good. I'm not sure yet. I think it's got the potential to work in a couple different places. It's obviously going to be cool to get off of Babbling Book and all those spell generators. In decks like Kazakis or /Reno Mage, I think this might be worth an inclusion just because it's a pretty high cost, high value card. So I'm curious to see what Greater Arcane Missiles can do. I think this is really, in the end, an above average card that might very well see play. Moving on to, I think, the last mage card I've got up for review here. This is the Cryomancer. 5 mana, 5/5, and Battlecry gain +2/+2 if an enemy is frozen. So this card is okay. Its base stats are just a little off vanilla. You'd expect a 5 mana, 5/6, but if the condition is met, this becomes a 5 mana, 7/7. Which is nearly as good as a 4 mana 7/7, in particular because Flame Wreath Faceless is actually in total a 6 mana 7/7. So this is not quite as fast as Flame Wreath Faceless, but a little bit more efficient. So kind of similar in many ways to that style of card. But in the end, I think the condition here is probably just too hard to actually meet. Yeah, there's blizzards. Yeah, there's the new freezing potion. Yeah, there's frostbolts. There's a lot of ways for Mage to freeze stuff, but it's not going to be that smooth or happen all that predictably. So, in particular, you can't blizzard into Cryomancer on a single 10 mana turn, right? So, you can't frostbolt into Cryomancer on turn 5. So, this becomes a late game card if you actually want the condition to be met. And, you know, just a single 7/7 isn't as intimidating in the late game. It's when you can get it out really early that it makes such a significant impact. So, I think it's a good card. I think it's fine. I think it's playable. It's certainly fine in Arena, too. But I don't know that it's better than other things you could run in its place. So, even though Cryomancer's probably okay, probably even decent, it's just not going to be overpowered enough, in my opinion, to make the cut compared to other cards. So I don't think this is one you're going to see often, even though it's really not a bad card at all. So let's move on to a few neutral cards. First up is the Naga Corsair, a 4 mana 5/4 pirate with a battlecry. Give your weapon +1 attack. So here's another pirate piece that could make a deck like Pirate Warrior or maybe even Pirate Rogue better than it already is. And Pirate Warrior is not actually a bad deck right now, so this many new pirate cards is kind of intriguing, because really Hobart fits and Naga Corsair certainly fits. That might be a good deck, but it's alarming how similar this card is to Captain Greenskin, which is a neutral legendary. And I would argue that Naga Corsair is actually even better than Captain Greenskin. It does not give your weapon +1 durability like Greenskin, but it's the same stats, and it's a mana cheaper, so it happens even faster. So it's honestly as good as a legendary that's been around forever. It hasn't seen a ton of play, which probably says that legendary is too weak, because Naga Corsair is a solid card. It's not overpowered. It's just decent. It's good. So I think that means Captain Greenskin's worse than decent. It's below average, in fact. This is a nice little card. I think it could be played in pirate decks. It has all the pieces, good stats for its cost, strong battle cry. I like it a lot. It's surprisingly good for a pirate neutral. Moving on to a card that's not surprisingly good. This is the Ancient of Blossoms, a 6-mana minion that is a 3/8 taunt. That's not very good, guys. There's a card called Bog Creeper for 7 mana that's a 6/8 taunt. So for only 1 mana, you're getting a much, much, much more imposing body. And that's not even like an overpowered or awesome card. That's a barely playable card that saw some limited play in like a Crusher Shaman deck once. So I wouldn't even say that card's good. Bog Creeper's probably just average. And this, in my mind, is considerably worse. So this is a pretty weak card that's going to be very, very difficult to play. 3 attack just doesn't do enough on turn 6 to make an impact. It's going to be really cheap and efficient to trade into this for opponents and just ignore your 6-mana play. So this is just not imposing or threatening enough to be good. Sorry, Ancient of Blossoms. I really like your artwork, and I wish you were a cool-looking druid card, but just not going to make the cut. So I think this is the final card for this review, the Defias Cleaner, a 6-mana 5/7 with a battle cry, silence a minion with a death rattle. So I don't really get the fantasy or lore of this card. I don't know why the Defias Cleaner is particularly good at silencing death rattle minions. I guess a cleaner is someone who cleans up after somebody's dead, so that kind of makes sense, I suppose. But I like this card. I think this is a sleeper good card. It's neutral, which is nice because anybody can run it. The stats aren't bad at all for a 6-drop. Like a 5/7 is actually really good because it kills 5 health stuff. It survives 2/5 attack stuff. 7 health is awkward because there's just not a lot of stuff at that health total and it's hard to deal with. And the silence effect here is halfway decent because most decks run some sort of death rattle card. It's the most prominent, I think, card text in the game, and battle cry too, but there are death rattles everywhere. There's a ton of good death rattles. Most good decks have Sylvanas or Tyrion or something of the sort. So there's a chance this counters that. If there are really prominent N'Zoth decks in particular, this one wouldn't help a ton in that regard. Like, yeah, I'd take care of the first death rattle, but the minion dying still means N'Zoth gets to resummon it, so it's not perfect in a N'Zoth meta, but it's still good as a mid-game answer to those Sylvanas and Cairns and all that annoying stuff, just so you can keep rolling and not have to deal with the Tyrion forging and so on and so forth. So the question is, right, it's a tech card of sorts, but it doesn't feel like a tech card because the stats are decent, so it probably just depends on the meta and the deck. I'd see this as more of a tournament card or very, very high ladder card than perhaps just a persistent or a pervasive inclusion in any sort of deck list. I don't think it's doing anything overpowered enough. It's more reactive in nature, so I like it. It's good. It has all the pieces to be a solid, strong card, but in the end, I don't know that it'll really be played all that much just because I don't know where it lives or what decks feel like they have to include Defias Cleaner in any world. So it's really meta dependent and deck dependent, but still a neat little card I'm glad Blizzard added into the game. So that's going to wrap it up for part 13 of my Mean Streets of Gadgetzan card review. If you have any thoughts or comments on these cards, you thought I got it all wrong, or maybe even if I got it all right, I'd love to hear your take, so leave a comment below. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.